that's where actually the second unconditional boundary comes in, what I call beacons, where we take a look at those things we have shared and we examine them. Do we still share those things? A beacon. Yeah, we shine a beacon like a big spotlight. We shine a beacon on this particular connection that we have made. And it was a connection in the past and has been a connection. So we shine a beacon on it every once in a while, again, every few months or a few years, depending on the relationship. And we say, do we still share this value? Is this still, because again, we all grow, we all change, we all evolve, and our values and our interests change over time. So if we sense that there might be something that isn't as smooth as it once was, then we can say, this isn't how I feel anymore. Or this doesn't seem to be how you feel anymore. Is that true? And you can have a conversation about that. And again, with all of the boundaries, one of the things that I teach is they don't always have to be verbal conversations. One of the things that I teach about boundaries is we can express boundaries through our actions.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 388 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Andy Lidstone, the Unconditional Coach. Andy's biggest dream is to help other people reach their goals, and his goal is to help people of all walks of life make their dreams into reality. He believes the best communities are the ones made up of people that build each other up and help one another reach for the stars. As he says on his website, let's learn to love one another through understanding that each of us has been writing our own story. Your story may share a scene or a chapter with someone, but only they really know what story they're writing. Most of us just want to believe our story matters, not that we're writing the right story. This conversation with Andy is important, not just for those of us who are introverts or trying to make connections with other writers at conferences and other places where writers and people from the publishing and writing community may gather, but it's also an important conversation related to all kinds of relationships that we have with others. And right now, admittedly, I'm struggling a lot with the relationships I have. I know a lot of people. I have relationships with people from across a wide range of values. And right now, I'm struggling intensely with people whose values seem to completely contradict my own values of love, acceptance, compassion, kindness, and respect. Not necessarily through the things they say, but some of the things they've done, because they don't align, at least in my perspective. And you'll hear Andy and I discuss his unconditional boundaries framework that helps with creating ways to manage this, to build stronger relationships, and to protect ourselves from harmful people and situations. And that's coming up later in this episode. But first, a little bit of personal update and a pretty hearty comment section for this episode. In terms of a personal update, I'm going to keep it pretty short. I'm in Vegas this week, which is probably why and I don't have I'm in a hotel room, and so I don't have the right microphone, and I'm just using a built-in one with my laptop, and therefore I'm going to try to keep this relatively short, but I do have some important things to mention. Similarly, so interestingly, I've been here, it's going to be Sunday to Saturday, the full week at Author Nation. So far, it's been a pretty dynamic conference. I'll probably talk more about that in a future episode once it's all done. I'm doing a presentation today. I'm recording this on the morning of Thursday, November 14th. And this is an interesting vacation because normally I enjoy the different breweries that are in Vegas, off the Strip, in the best part of town, which is the Arts District, and that's where Brewery Row is. So that's my kind of place. But I was in Brewery Row on Sunday night, having dinner with some friends, and then I went back on Monday night because, again, it's actually an affordable place. But unfortunately, I ended up having a hamburger at one of the places, and this is not that it's bad. I think the food is good. I am Canadian, and in Canada, we actually it's illegal to have a burger served at a restaurant anything but well done. And this is just because of the biology of the way hamburgers are made, where the E. coli that normally sits on the edge of the meat, on a steak, when it gets seared even slightly, that kills the E. coli off. But when you grind it in, the E. coli is throughout the entire meat, which is why it's important to cook it all the way through. Well, as a Canadian, I'm not used to E. coli or mild forms of E. coli being in my food. And therefore, normally when I order a burger, I make them do it extra well done, and that usually means it's well done because they always try to go lighter because they like to have their medium and rare. In any case, I had a delicious burger on a Monday night when I was out with some friends, and then I got to bed at a relatively decent time. I think I was in bed by 11:30, maybe midnight, and then 1 a.m. I woke up and it was 2 exits, no waiting. I ended up spending most of the night curled up on the bathroom floor. I became completely dehydrated, no energy. I could barely get out of bed the next morning. Thank goodness my colleague, Drafted Digital Megan, went to CVS and got me some electrolytes and a banana and Boost and Pepto-Bismol. And I managed to be able to crawl out of bed late morning to get in to do some duties that I had as a room moderator in the afternoon, and slowly coming back. I may try solid foods today on Thursday, but here's the good news. I'm gonna look at the positive. The good news is I did not spend nearly as much money as I normally spend in Vegas, and maybe even more so. The diet I'd been planning on starting, I guess, started early. I got a little crash start on my diet in terms of not consuming any food for the last several days and not drinking any alcohol. I've actually managed a couple club sodas yesterday, so I was pretty excited about that. But anyways, that's it for the personal update. And see, I'm going to look for the positive. I'm going to look for the positive in food poisoning. So in any case, I am feeling better, and it's so amazing. So many people at the conference, I guess, had found out, where's Mark? Like, Mark's laying in bed half dead. So many people were so compassionate and so caring, and it's a reminder that there are so many people who care for others, and that's a good thing to be reminded of, particularly in today's climate. So, without further ado, I'm going to play a bumper, and I'm going to read some comments from the most recent episode 387. Okay, so comments from recent episodes. Now, I've received emails, text messages, direct messages, and I've had a number of people quietly whisper to me when I met them here at Author Nation in Vegas their thanks for episode 387, in which I just turned on the mic and I spoke for about half an hour about what I was feeling and why I was feeling it as a result of the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Now, I've decided to keep the commenters anonymous. But how interesting what that says about how they need to be fearful for themselves and for the people that they love. I hate that we live in a world where pride in things like who you are have to hide. Don't get me wrong. If you're a racist, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic asshole, I really wish you would go back into your own disgusting closet. Ideally, a closet that's airtight, because I'm done with you. Too many of those people are, yet again, feeling emboldened about wanting to return the Western world to the 1920s, where basically heterosexual white men had all the privilege and no one else had any of it. No, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about people whose existence isn't about oppressing others. It's about living free and loving free. Both the others that they want to love, and just as importantly, maybe more importantly, loving and respecting themselves for who they are. But here are just a few of those comments, and I'm not going to respond to those comments because I've already responded personally to the people who mentioned these things to me. But I want to share that with you, listener, in case you're listening and also feeling, no, it may just be me. You're not alone. So the first comment that came in was, hey, Mark, just wanted to say I'm listening to your Stark Reflections and thank you. Thank you for using your platform to speak out. It's strange to think that as a male presenting non-binary queer author, my greatest risk will be jail time for writing stories about people like me, or losing protections for my orientation and gender in the workplace, or never getting the chance to legally acknowledge 13 years of being with my partner. It's strange that when I think of that likely future of Project 2025 comes to pass, I can't fear for my future because I hurt more thinking of the fate of my trans brothers and sisters and the fate of so many women. I need you to know, no matter what hate you get from that post, it means so much to people like me. The next comment. Thank you for your latest podcast. You verbalized what I've been feeling almost to a T. I'm still hunkering down, not knowing what to do or how to respond. As an old straight white guy, I don't yet know how to be in the world right now. I don't know how to support others yet. I don't know how to show my anger while being so privileged either. And the final comment I'm going to share from the many comments I received is this one. Just thought I'd send you a note to say I loved your last podcast episode, and I appreciate your bravery in making it. It was cathartic to hear someone else grappling with the aftermath. Lots of baffled, angry swearing in my household too this week. But mostly I've just felt numb. And I found that your naming these feelings of betrayal spot on. I confess a few tears may have escaped at that point, but it has helped me move back to anger and from anger. I can write again, which feels so very important now. I won't call it a silver lining because the reality is too awful, but one thing we can say is that we'll have no shortage of source material for our villains. So I want to thank those commenters as well as everyone who messaged me and sent me so many wonderful personal comments and talked to me about this very privately and quietly. I appreciate you letting me know because I know it's a difficult thing to do, but I think it's important when you have a voice, when you have a platform, to speak out for those things that you feel strongly about. Because, I always wonder about those people who didn't speak up, in Nazi Germany. And I know how easy it is not to. I know how difficult it is when you believe that the majority are a certain way. But one thing, and that's why I chose that last comment, one thing to remind you as writers, as creators, it is so important. You are so important. The stories you write are so important because it can give you an opportunity to analyze. And here's the thing, and this is something I remember talking to Kevin Anderson about during the early part of the pandemic. Why would we want to write horror stories and scary things? It's like, well, in the fiction, the good can win, good can triumph over evil. And even in those scary things, and when you close the book, it goes away. On the positive side, romance titles continue to be, the by and large international best-selling titles because love wins. And happy endings are so critically important, and we need that. The world so needs those stories as well. Doesn't mean you have to write romance, but it's just an element of sometimes the escape into the worlds that you create as writers can be so empowering for so many people. So don't forget your value and your importance as a writer is more important than it ever was. Please, please do not give up on yourself. If you're struggling and you're having a difficult time, I understand. Take whatever time you need. But please, in the long run, do not give up on yourself. I'm not going to give up on you. I hope you don't give up on yourself. Well, that's it for the introductory matter for this episode. I'm going to roll the bumper, as I like to do, and we can get into this conversation that I had with Andy. I think it was back in early September of 2024. Hey, Andy, welcome to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to chat with you again. Great to have you on the podcast for the first time. Though, before we get started talking about, I guess it's unconditional boundaries is the topic
Yes.
of this episode. Before we get into that, let's take a look at Andy's creative life and maybe where did it all start for you?
Yeah. I wanted to be a writer for many years. Interesting. It was an interesting journey for me though, because I didn't enjoy writing in school or as a young man very much. Mostly because I resented being forced to in school. I
Okay,
hated writing. I hated writing essays. I hated writing book reports.
right,
As a matter of fact, I didn't get a diploma because I hated writing so much in school. I had been told to write.
right. Okay, so how did that change for you then in terms of like that? Where did you discover your passion for writing then? If it
It
wasn't
was
forced on you at
Yeah,
school.
yeah. Well, in my, I guess in my mid to late 20s, I'd been playing Dungeons and Dragons, as a lot of us did, a lot of us nerdy types did. Um, and I'd had this character in my head for a very long time. And I guess, yeah, in about, somewhere in the late 90s, 2000, somewhere in there, I decided to write the story of my evil wizard. And that got me into writing in the first place. And I did that for a long time. But what actually got lit my passion for writing was, after my wife left, and her and I split up. I started writing articles about my experience with depression and what it's like to have ADD and different nonfiction like articles.
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
yeah.
wrote a blog, and wrote a bunch of stuff, and I used to sit in Tim Hortons a lot and sit there for hours, 8-10 hours in a day, just writing articles, and I loved it.
Hmm.
I had people ask me what I was doing and comment on my writing, and that's actually what lit the passion for writing in me, was writing about my experience, and with the intention of helping other, specifically guys, but other people that were going through um, different experiences, depression, what it's like to be in relationships, have a relationship end on you.
Right.
I wrote a couple more as the pandemic hit and that sort of stuff. So, I'd had a difficult experience with things, so I really wanted to write those articles, and that actually, in 2017, I think I wrote probably 20 articles in the month of April of 2017, which was a
Wow.
string for me. I think I wrote maybe 3 or 4 before that, and another half dozen since then. But in that
Right.
month, I wrote a lot of articles.
So
So
the
that's
motivation, I guess the motivation was you were going through something and you were kind of journaling, writing articles, expressing, sharing,
yeah,
and putting those up on your blog.
yeah.
And then that way anyone could
Could
discover
read
them.
them.
And
Yeah,
so you did find that it was resonating with people, right? Like, because
yeah,
like, oh my God, I'm not alone. I've experienced something like this too.
yeah. Well, specifically, I wrote the articles from a perspective of trying to help others who are going through what I'd gone through.
Okay. All right.
I had sections like, this is my experience. If this is you, or if another article or another section was, if this is someone you know, and then I had like a conclusion as to, this is what you can do to change your experience, or have a different experience. So mostly from the perspective of trying to help others, which of course that's how a lot of us eventually do our own healing, or our own, you know, growth journey, is through trying to help others. Not all of us, but a lot of us do that. For me,
Right.
that was the experience. That was the evolution into life coaching eventually too. Was I wanted
Okay.
to help others, and through doing that, I managed to do a lot of my own healing.
So it's interesting that that writing, which was writing with a purpose, right? The purpose of helping others, and then that segues beautifully into your role as a life coach.
Yeah,
But you had this. I want to go back for a second to this wizard, the character
yeah,
that you had sort of grown up with. Is it
yeah.
sort of a long-term character in campaigns that you
Yeah,
leverage?
it was the first character I had ever played when I played Dungeons and Dragons, and then of course I only played, a handful of times, and then that a buddy of mine got a hold of a bunch of books, and we were all sitting around trying to figure out who's going to run the game, and I was nominated as the dungeon master,
Okay.
just because nobody else wanted to do it, and I was the one that was
Okay.
least objective to it.
Okay.
And Kinlar, that wizard, tended to be the hand behind all the evil machinations that were going on. Whatever was the point of the campaign, he was always the guy with his hand on the pulse behind the scenes. He was rarely ever actually part of the game. Only occasionally did he ever actually show up.
Okay.
But it was always his, evil plan that was running things in the background.
So that was the more creative, imaginary, make things up rather than write about real life things and issues.
Yeah, and I think that's where the healing started, is because I'd always felt like I had this dark side of myself, and I'd always struggled up until that point to figure out, where does this dark side of myself belong, right? A lot of us have this thought. Now, I
Yeah.
would I would argue that almost all of us have this dark side. Many of us just don't know what to do with it, and
Right,
that was
right.
my experience, right? So I
Okay.
wrote about it. I wrote short stories. I have a trilogy in the works. I haven't published anything with Kinlar yet, because again, by the time I got into the passion for writing, I had pivoted over into the nonfiction stuff. So yeah,
Right.
it was somebody that I had a passion for. He was just
Okay.
a character that was in my life a long time.
Okay, cool. So I mean, this is obviously some passion projects that you're putting into
Yeah,
into writing. With the nonfiction, so you've published the stuff for it's free, anyone can read
yeah,
it
yeah.
on your blog. Do you have you taken that and done anything else with that nonfiction writing?
With those articles, I haven't done much more than publish them onto my blog. I've gone back and re-edited a couple of the articles, but I haven't done much with those other than the one article where I was talking about boundaries. That's what
Right.
spawned this concept of unconditional boundaries.
Yeah.
I'd been talking about different aspects of relationships, and different aspects of what it's like to be a man, and my perspective of faith and beliefs, and I guess that was, I didn't know it at the time, but it was kind of an ulterior motive for writing these articles, was to kind of share who I am. One of the
Right.
difficulties I had in my marriage was I didn't feel her, nor was I paying too much attention to who she was,
Right.
right? So there wasn't a lot of connection, person to person, like deep core connection between the two of us. Most of our connection was very, very shallow and surface level.
Right. Right.
So that was kind of what I was writing about in these articles, was just, who am I? This is who I am, and the people who saw that and related to that, is the people that I still am friends with, most of them today.
Okay. All right. Cool. So let's talk about unconditional boundaries. Let's talk about so you took that initial article and you've
Yeah,
built something like larger from that, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the idea behind unconditional boundaries is, I wanted to create a system for building relationships. And my experience had been people setting boundaries, myself included. I was taught how to set boundaries, how to stop people from taking advantage of me. I was a people pleaser, as so many of us are.
Hmm.
And I was told, well, you got to set some boundaries and stop people from taking advantage of you. I'm like, yeah, great, that's awesome. Except when I set boundaries, nobody comes into my life. Like I've pushed everybody away. It felt like I was pushing everybody away by setting boundaries, and
Right.
I wanted a system for using boundaries to do the opposite and invite people closer to me.
Okay, that's interesting. So the boundary actually helps create a
Invite,
bridge, and I'm looking at a
yeah,
bridge behind you.
yes,
Okay.
that's actually the inspiration for this picture, was this whole
Okay.
unconditional boundaries concept, right? The bridge is both a boundary between the city and the park, plus it's a bridge between two halves of the city, or two different cities, in you might say.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, that's the concept. Is a bridge is designed to connect people. A bridge is a way to invite people closer to us. And actually, I use the word invitation when I'm describing bridges, because one of the core aspects, characteristics of a bridge, is the other person has the permission to accept or refuse that bridge, that
Okay.
invitation. So if we send out an invitation, if we extend a bridge to somebody, there isn't an expectation that they'll cross it, that they'll bring their own bridge and connect with us. There is simply an invitation. If we
Okay.
send out an invitation, to a party, we're having a party for like 50 people, and we send out 50 invitations, there's no expectation that all 50 are going to show up. We expect some will,
Yeah.
right? Maybe most, but not all. And we often don't have a decision as to which ones are which,
Right. Right.
right? That's the point of an invitation, is they have that permission to say yes or no.
Okay. And so with the boundaries, how do you juxtapose how do you
Juxtapose.
juxtaposition? I don't know what I'm saying here.
Yes, yeah.
How do you align the boundaries with the bridge? And because again, when you hear those two B words, you think boundaries is putting up a wall, it's blocking people off. Bridges are obviously connecting.
Correct.
Where do
So
they cross over?
the idea was, originally, I saw boundaries as exactly that: putting up a wall, creating a space, putting a chasm between us. Um, so I wanted a way to connect, yet I wanted a way to connect without having to pull down all the walls. Like
Okay.
I still wanted to have a definition of who you are versus who I am.
Okay.
Like, I'm not you, you're not me. I don't take responsible for your actions, your feelings. I don't take responsibility for those things. Um, at the same time, I want some sort of a connection. I want some ability to connect two separate beings, two separate entities, two
Okay.
separate people. Because boundaries are really great at identifying myself as different than you, as separate from you. As they talk about in the original Boundaries book, um, it's like putting a fence around your yard. So it's good at identifying, this is me in my space, and that's
Yeah.
you in your space, and they don't mix. But that doesn't do much to help us connect. So the idea was to keep that definition of who you are separate from who I am, but at the same time offer a place to join. So the analogy that I use is two sister cities across a major river like the Mississippi, where they're bridging across, and they might have several bridges across between the two cities, and each bridge would be a different connection, a different reason to connect, a different
Okay.
flavor. We might both like eating out, but one of us likes Chinese and one of us likes Mexican, right?
Right.
So there's a connection there, but it's only kind of a connection because we like the surface level of eating out, but not necessarily the same food,
Okay. All right.
right? So and then we might have other connections, like playing Dungeons and Dragons, for example, or writing books or whatever, right?
Okay. All right.
Um, one of the connections you and I have is writing, right?
Yeah.
Obviously,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that we met through. Yeah, we don't write the same thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we
There's
are
still, okay, differentiation, but we still have
right.
that connection of this is something that's important to us.
Correct. So there's a defining difference. I'm not responsible for influencing your writing or for taking control of your writing, nor you mine. Yet there's still a connection. There's still a shared experience of what it's like to write.
Okay.
Right. So that's the idea of a bridge. That's the idea of kind of melding those two concepts.
So what I guess I'm looking at the side effect of when you make a connection of actually when you remove the barriers, there's obviously some risks that are involved, right?
Right. When you just take down the walls, we often, and I experienced this when I took down my walls, I would often lose who I am.
Okay.
I would lose myself in relationships. As a people pleaser, I would become whatever they needed me to be so
Right.
that I didn't lose the relationship. I
Okay.
would lose that definition of who I am.
Right.
And or I often would expect them to also lose their definition of who they are,
Right. And that's
right?
not a recipe for that's not a recipe
No, not for good
for healthy.
relationships,
Yeah.
not for good relationships, not for healthy lifestyle. Like it messes up a whole bunch of things, which is a major portion of the cause for the breakdown of my marriage. I was expecting her to lose a portion of herself, and
Right.
I was losing a portion of myself, and that isn't even speaking for her half of the experience, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so that was the point. As I wanted to create a way to connect without having to lose myself in these connections without having to give up who I am.
Okay. Right.
Right.
So, this is a podcast for writers. Writers are of, mostly they may identify with introversion and
Yes.
preferring to be sitting behind a keyboard and making up
Yes.
stories rather than interacting, because interacting can be scary, can be intimidating,
Correct.
it can be worrisome. But so, what are some strategies then when you're connecting? So, for example, we met at When Words Collide in
Yes.
Calgary, Alberta, and obviously we had a shared connection because there were multiple layers of. We're both writers. Both I haven't played Dungeons and Dragons in a long time, but I was familiar and
And we're
stuff like
both
that.
kind of
So
nerdy types, and we both share some of the passions, right? That sort of stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So my suggestion, and this is what I teach in the class that I teach about unconditional boundaries, is to take a few of your more publicly appropriate or publicly shareable values and interests, the things that
okay,
you might talk about in the lineup at a grocery store, or
yeah,
at a party with somebody you barely met, right?
yeah,
Take those interests, those values and interests that you're okay with sharing with other people, and you think they're reasonably normal or reasonably defining of who you are. And then just when you're out in public, when you are around somebody else, just share some of those things. Just talk about some of those things.
okay,
You know, small talk is mostly about things neither one of us care about, but it can be about the things we care about, but aren't really that big a deal.
oh, I see. So it's kind of like putting the fishing line out, testing the waters to see if there's
Yeah,
something deeper there, right? Okay.
right,
All
right.
right.
For example, the at words collide. There was the assumption that we're all writers. So, unlike most writers, I'm more of an extrovert. So, while I was there, I made a point of trying to reach out to and make connections with several people, several dozen actually,
Right.
to try and test out this theory, but also to make some new friends. I'd been in the coaching world for quite a while, but I hadn't been in the writing world for a few years.
Right. Okay.
I had pivoted, right? So I wanted to make some new writing friends, and so I just reached out and said, okay, I got long hair. Let's all be long haired writers, right? We like to write. I like to write fantasy. I like to write, about boundaries. What do you write, right? And just send out some things that just talk about things that were of interest to me. And the interesting part about that is the vast majority of people I attempted to connect with didn't share a lot of my values. So a lot of I would say as much as 90% of the bridges I sent out didn't get accepted.
Okay.
But I sent out enough bridges that I still made 6 or 7 friends that weekend.
Okay, well, that which is fantastic. So, I mean, part of
right?
the goal was making some new connections, which you did.
Which I did,
Yeah,
right? So that would be my suggestion to people is just take some of your values, your interests, the things that you don't mind sharing with other people that you're kind of, you think are easy ways to connect and that are important to you, important enough that you'd want your friends to at least share some of those things
right.
and just
Okay.
just start talking about them. You don't have to talk too hard about them. You don't have to start up conversations. You don't have to, go and be stand up on a stage. Just, when there's a conversation going on that is about one of your interests, just join the conversation and have something to say.
So I'm gonna take this back as a sort of a potential practical examination of trying this out as an introverted type of person
Yeah.
myself, rather than coming up to you and saying, "Hey, Andy, I'd love to get into an in-depth talk with you about morality and politics and blah blah blah." But instead, I could say, "Hey, Andy, oh my God, that the skull on the sleeve of your shirt is awesome. Where'd you get that shirt?" Because I love
Right.
skulls, and that's a part of my
Correct.
persona and stuff like that. So then suddenly you can tell potentially a story of where you found the shirt, or maybe it was from a local artist, or whatever it is,
Right.
and
Right.
then that begins that sort of, it's better than, oh, it's a hot day today, isn't it? You know?
Right. Like a hot day today. Like, who cares? A hot day is something we all experience and nobody actually cares about.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And
Unless, I
unless
mean,
you're
unless they really want to get to some air conditioning or
right,
whatever, get
unless
some
that is
water.
actually a big deal for some reason, but it's not like it's small talk that most of us don't care about.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
more and more I find more people these days are not interested in that sort of small talk.
yeah,
They're not
yeah,
interested in talking about the things that neither one of us are interested in.
yeah, yeah. Because really, this is just sort of filling the
Filling the
uncomfortable
space.
silence. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So if you're going to fill the space with those kind of shallow, um, less risky values and interests,
right,
right?
right. Yeah. So yeah, and then for example, skulls and
Yeah.
Halloween is coming up, and there's potentially a story, because I mean, who was the artist of the? Where did you get it? Like, where did? Oh, no, no, it was
Yeah.
interesting story. A friend of mine picked this up in Atlanta at Dragon
Right.
Con. I don't know, whatever the case may be,
Whatever the
right?
story
Yeah,
might be, right? And
yeah,
then there can be a conversation there. It's still reasonably small as far as small talk is concerned. It's not a high investment conversation.
yeah, yeah.
It doesn't require a lot of emotional vulnerability,
Right.
but it
Yeah,
is but it is still something that's important to us, right? And
yeah,
that's where friendships are created, right? And that's how we create new friendships. That's how we build our relationships. As a matter of fact, that's also how we take our existing relationships and make them closer.
okay,
The more we get to know somebody, the deeper the values and interests we would share, right?
right.
Somebody that I have met and talked about, the skull on my shirt, and we've had a conversation about that. The next time we talk, we might talk about, what beer do you drink, which is another interest you have, right?
It is. How did you know?
First of all, I've heard you talk about it several times on your podcast, but second, we also went out for lunch, right? And you talked about
Yeah,
craft
and
beer
and
some.
and and had a few craft beers while we were having
Right.
lunch. So
Right. So
yeah,
so that's another interest we could have, right? Maybe
yeah,
it's a little bit more emotionally risky.
yeah,
So you don't want to say that first, but maybe it's the second thing you say. And then as you
yeah,
get closer, you might talk about things like politics and religion or some of these other things eventually down the road once you've built some rapport, some
right.
trust, once you've created some of this connection. So that's how we create deeper connections, right? That's how we get
Right.
closer to somebody.
So yeah, you're starting off at something relatively safe, surface level, and
Yeah.
then sort of continually potentially extending other bridges that may be appropriate at the right time. So it's kind
Correct.
of like, like let's go out for coffee first before
Yeah.
before we decide to get married. Like,
Correct. Correct. So
let's
there's an
check this
evolution
out.
in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, yeah. There's that sort of connection, and then the longer conversations, and then getting, and then I think I'm always fascinated with, because again, you end up, as you put the term, putting these bridges out, and sometimes they connect and sometimes they don't, because sometimes you initiate with a conversation, and you're like, and there's an old Monty Python sketch, waiter, this conversation isn't very good, because the waiter comes and sells them a conversation off the menu because they
Right. Right.
didn't know what to talk about. But
Right.
sometimes that actually happens. Nobody says this conversation isn't very good, but you're both looking for ways to comfortably leave without offending the other person.
Correct.
And sometimes you get into a conversation with someone and suddenly 20 minutes have passed or an hour has passed,
Correct.
and you're still standing there. And it was
Correct.
this initial 1 minute, hey, I like the skulls on your shirt, and then suddenly it's an in-depth conversation. And I'm always fascinated, like, how did that happen?
Yeah, yeah. And that's what happens is underneath behind the scenes, we're sending out these bridges. We're sending out these invitations. Here's this thing I'm interested in. Here's this value that I have, this thing that's important to me. Here's this, this belief that I have, right? Any of
Yeah.
those things can create a connection. And the more we share, the more we want to connect. The interesting part about that is it's often the introverts that have those 20-minute conversations or hour-long conversations where they might be at a conference and there's hundreds of other people just passing by them and they didn't even notice because they're in this intimate conversation with somebody.
Right.
And what happens is it's because we're sharing bridges. We're sharing these interests, these values, these beliefs,
Oh,
and how fast we get close to somebody depends entirely on how many bridges we send out and how often.
right, right.
Right?
So
Sometimes you have 10, 20, 30 connections in a single conversation. Sometimes you'll have one or two and then you won't talk again for a year.
yeah, yeah.
Right?
I guess what about people who have potentially that fear of rejection, right? So I'm gonna reach out, and I'm gonna try something, and like nothing's working, right? Like I tried
Right.
this and whatever, and I got the glazed over face of like you're bothering me or whatever.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it could just be inadvertent because their mind is somewhere else, or they're on their way to
Yeah.
a panel or whatever. So how do you deal with that fear? I guess that fear of, well, writers, fear of
Yeah.
rejection, right?
Fear of rejection, right? We're familiar with that. Yeah, how do you deal with that? First of all, the thing that I tell myself is that it's mostly about a connection. If the connection wasn't built, say you said something about the skull on my shirt, and I'm like, I don't know, it just was on my shirt. I don't know where it came from, and there's no story there. I
Yeah.
know it's an awkward silence for a couple seconds, and then
Yeah.
we either send out a different bridge and try a different conversation, or we walk away.
Or
Right?
yeah.
Right? There wasn't a connection made. There was
Right.
no
Right.
there was no chemistry started. It's not necessarily a rejection. It's just a lack of connection.
Right. And it's not the end of the world. It's just okay, this isn't
Right.
right. Just like certain foods I just don't enjoy. So
Right.
I'm
Right.
not gonna partake. I'm not gonna eat them.
Yeah.
I'm an
Yeah. And
adult, I can
actually,
choose.
this is actually where a lot of friendships, relationships, other kinds of relationships get into trouble. Is they've built a few connections, they've built a few bridges, and they have connected on a few topics, and then they share something else that the other person doesn't share, and then they feel rejected. Right?
Right.
Maybe we were talking about the skull on my shirt, and then I bring up craft beer, and that's really not something you want to talk about or share with me.
Right. Right.
Then
Yeah.
we have this awkward silence, and that's where we feel, well, we had this connection, and now it just deleted or it stopped. And what I usually teach people, what I usually tell people, and what I experience myself is that's simply not a part of our friendship. It's not a rejection. It's just
Right.
absent from our friendship.
Right. Because we're going to talk about fashion. We're going to talk about skulls, but we're not going to talk about alcoholic beverages. That's not our thing.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
not
All
our
right.
thing. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean we're not friends. It just means that's not a part of our friendship.
And I guess I see that with different friends that I have from different areas of my life, that there's certain friends I talk about certain things with because we're
Correct.
into it, and other friends, not going there. And
Correct.
and in some cases, I think there's some relationships. So for example, I can think of some relationships I've had where we were friends because of a geographical situation,
Yeah.
right? Neighbors,
Yeah.
kids
Yeah.
are playing together all the time.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have a connection through our kids, through the fact that we live next door to one another. Therefore, we're going to hang out and do a lot of things together.
Yeah. Just because
And
the
yeah,
thing that we share is where we live and who our kids play with.
and then as the relationship developed, I realized that there were still a number of connections,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there were also some other significant probably maybe more meaningful or deeper morality questions where we
Right.
differed. And
Correct.
that's where I found that when I moved away, I didn't want to continue that
Right. You
relationship
don't
because I
make an
realized the
effort.
relationship was built on
Yeah.
these connections that no longer exist.
Right. And that's just it. That's great. When we have a shallow relationship, a shallow friendship that's built on shallow interests and shallow values and beliefs, that's great for a shallow friendship. And we need
Right.
those. Right? We
Yeah.
need those throwaway friendships that maybe we're friends for 10 minutes, maybe we're friends for 10 years, but there's not a lot of high level investment.
Right. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And we need those. We need those ones that aren't so emotionally draining. So that when I need to, just talk about the weather, I got somebody I can do that with.
Right. Right. Okay.
Right. At the same time, they're low investment relationships. So therefore, we don't have to keep them. So those things that you didn't share, there's two options with those things. Either you both recognize you don't share those values, so they're just not a part of your friendship. They just are left out. There's something you don't talk about, and you don't, attempt to reconnect on those things. Maybe every, once in a while, every few months or a few years, you might check to see if there's a difference in values there,
Right. Right.
um,
Yeah.
to see if there's a connection that can be made. Because we all grow and
Yeah.
change. So, but you don't put a lot of pressure on each other to have those things. That's the one thing that can happen. And you
Okay.
can have a good, healthy friendship or relationship, especially in romantic situations. This is often the case. You can have a good, healthy relationship if you can recognize that these things just aren't a part of our relationship. They don't have to be.
Right. Right.
They're not
Okay.
required. But the
Okay.
other thing that can happen is one or both insist that they should be shared values. There's
Right.
this word should. We should have this shared value, right?
Right. Like I
We,
can't be friends with you because you don't like
because
skulls, and I can't be a friend with anyone who doesn't like skulls. Right.
correct. And this is
Okay.
often the case in deeper friendships, in romantic relationships. But for many of us, it's also the case in our more shallow friendships, our working relationships. I don't want to work with you because you don't like to eat lunch at the same time I do.
Yeah.
And that can be a thing for some people, right?
Yeah.
It's
Or
more
actually, we
often
could work together better because then we can alternate eating shifts so that the
correct.
place is covered, right? Okay.
Right. So that no, we're not both gone at the same time. That's correct. Or sometimes it is become I don't want to work with you because you're on the right side, but I'm on the left side.
Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
those become deep values for some people. Or I don't want to work with you, or I don't want to date you because your parents are a different color than my parents,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Or I don't want to be friends with you because you know you prefer to sleep during the day and I prefer to sleep at night,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So those kinds of things can become a big deal breaker for some people. So when we insist that those things need to be shared in order for this relationship to continue, that's where things can get toxic and dangerous.
Right. Okay.
And that's where I bring in the third type of boundary, which is what most people would understand as boundaries, but I clearly define them as a barrier.
Okay.
We are putting in a barrier between ourselves on this particular topic.
Okay.
And as long as that barrier is respected, and we say, and one or both of us says, okay, we intentionally will not bring this into our friendship or our relationship.
Right.
This, this is, we've decided, one or both of us has decided this thing will not be a part of our relationship. And as long as we
Right.
can both agree and respect that, we can still keep our connections on other topics.
Okay.
When we choose not to, that's when we go to the traditional sense of boundaries and use what I would call barriers, and use those barriers and say, okay, I'm not going to connect with you. I'm not going to be around you. I'm not going to be in the room with you or talking with you or present with you or whatever the case may be on when we're talking about this topic or when we're doing this thing. Like I won't
Right.
go out for dinner with you because we really don't like the same foods,
Right.
or I won't go to concerts with you because I prefer to be sleeping when they happen, or things like
Right.
that.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, so that's when we would normally, under normal healthy relationships, we would just kind of understand those things and there's no conversation required.
Right.
But if one or both sides insist that they have to be shared, then we can set up a boundary and say no. We can set up a barrier and say no, this is not going to be shared, and
Right.
that may or may not negatively impact your relationship. This is why I call them a barriers. I call them a barrier because a barrier does create a space. It creates a distance between
Right,
two
right.
people.
And yeah, and I guess there's certain things where, okay, so or we like going out to eat, but I can't stand Thai food, and we both enjoy Chinese food, and we both enjoy Mexican food, we both enjoy Italian food. We
Right.
don't go to Thai places together. We can
Correct.
go to other places, right? That
Correct.
where we have that shared commonality. I think another thing I think about is and I think about drinking, right? Because it's a
Yeah.
very social thing, right? Going out, and I love one of the things I love about the craft beer scene is I love because I travel alone alone by myself. Yeah, very redundant, but I travel alone and I go out by myself to various places, and I love talking to the bartender or the owner or whatever the
Yeah.
establishment,
Yeah.
learning a little bit about the local lore, like, oh, this beer's made here, or who owns the place, or just learning a little because it's interesting and
Yeah.
it's something I have an interest in.
Right.
But I
It's
mean,
something
right
to create a
now,
conversation around.
yeah, the conversation's around sort of the setting, or it's around the
Yeah.
content of what's happening. But so let's say I decided I'm not going to drink anymore, and
Right.
all of my friends that I share, all the common things are is we go to craft beer places together, we go to craft beer events, we go to the local brewery, we meet at the local bar, and I'm thinking, oh, I can't have a conversation about the taste of this beer versus the taste of that beer anymore because I don't partake in beer anymore. And
Right.
that's where potentially I'm curious about the renegotiation. It's like I
Yes.
still value you and the things we talk about, but maybe we're not gonna. I mean, I'm going to enjoy the smells and the sounds and maybe all the other experiences. I'm just not going to drink it anymore.
Correct.
Maybe
And
I develop.
you might still experience, you might still enjoy the lore of the area or the
Yeah,
owner or the person, right, or the business, but not the conversation about booze,
yeah, yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so that's where actually the second unconditional boundary comes in, what I call beacons, where we take a look at those things we have shared and we examine them. Do we still share those things?
What do you call them?
A beacon. We
Oh, a
shine a
beacon.
beacon.
Beacon. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, we shine a beacon like a big spotlight. We shine a
Okay,
beacon on this particular connection that we have made. And it was a connection in the past and has been a connection. So we shine a beacon on it every once in a while, again,
okay,
every few months or a few years, depending on the relationship.
right.
And we say, do we still share this value?
Okay,
Is this still, because again, we all grow, we all change, we all
yeah, of
evolve,
course.
and our
Yeah,
values and our interests change over
yeah,
time. So if we sense that there might be something that isn't as smooth as it once was, then we can say this isn't how I feel anymore, or this doesn't seem to be how you feel anymore. Is that true?
right. Okay,
And you can have a conversation about that. And again, with all of the boundaries, one of the things that I teach is they don't always have to be verbal conversations.
okay,
One of the things that I teach about boundaries is we can express boundaries through our actions, right? Simply by, joining into conversations about, skulls or craft beer or writing or whatever the case may be. That says that we have this shared interest. We don't have to
right.
say, oh, we have this shared interest, let's be friends on that topic.
Yeah, yeah. We don't we have to get out a little contract and say, okay, these
Right,
shared.
exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It kind of happens dynamically.
Right. The same thing with beacons. When we shine a light on our values, we don't necessarily have to say, "Oh, this value has changed in you or in me. Let's reevaluate if we still share that belief or that interest anymore."
Right, right,
We don't have to do that verbally. We can, and often we should, maybe in some situations, depending on the relationship. It, but communication isn't exclusively verbal. We
okay,
can express those things simply by changing our actions. And if the other person picks up on those things, then maybe they'll just naturally change. Like that bridge will naturally change.
right,
But then if we don't share something, that's where the barriers come in. Is if there is something one or both of us is trying to share. Often the person who doesn't want to share that thing is the person who puts up the barrier.
right, right.
Right. This is
Okay,
what happens often in abusive relationships or toxic relationships, where one person is saying, we must do this thing or believe this thing or act this way, and the other person isn't interested. They
right.
don't want to. And that's where we get into the abuse, where we get into, one person is trying to control the other, one person is trying to force the other. So the person who wants to put up the barrier, this is why I say a barrier, because I do want to make it clear we are creating space. What a lot of us have done, the practice of setting boundaries for most of us, has been trying to protect myself from the harm I'm feeling, but still hold on to this relationship I don't want to lose.
Right, right.
Right. And that's why I said, this is why I've described barriers as creating space. Because if you're trying to protect yourself from something that's being harmful in your relationship, you're not going to try and hold on to that at the same time as protecting yourself from it.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
if you do, this is where you are what they might call enabling the abuse.
Right, okay. So, what are some ways that people can understand? Because relationships and the connections and the bridges and all the things we have with other people can be so complex. We
Yes,
can't necessarily see maybe don't even see the harmful part of it.
correct, correct. So this is where I simplify it to, part of the process is knowing your values versus what you can see about the other person's values, interests, and beliefs. But we start with values.
Okay.
It's difficult to set boundaries if you don't even know what you want,
Okay. Fair enough.
right? So we start with what you want. A lot of people can describe what they don't want,
Right.
but it's actually a very large percentage of people can that don't know what they do want.
Right.
So that's where we talk with about what your values are. Your interests, your beliefs, those things are easier to describe, but your values are difficult for many people. I've had
Right.
clients of mine that are like, I don't even know what my values are. So we start
Huh.
there.
Okay.
Once you know what your values are, then you can compare your values to what you see the other person's values being.
Okay.
And
And that's
in
through their actions, maybe through what they
yeah,
say. Okay, even if
yeah,
even
their
if they haven't
actions.
come out and said, "I believe this" or "My value is this." Okay.
Correct.
All
Yeah.
right.
And so at the most um at the most core, we would actually have a conversation and say, this is my value, that is your value, and we would compare those values. But we don't, like you were just saying, we don't have to actually have the conversation. You can look at their actions, you can look at their words, you can look at what your experience of them has been, and compare that to what your values are. And at that point, you can decide what to do. Often we would have a conversation, especially if we're trying to set up a barrier. But the problem is we don't always have to. If your values seem so different from theirs that it's causing harm to one or both of you, sometimes having a conversation or insisting that we need to have the conversation just delays the inevitable results, right?
Right. Right. Okay.
Because we insist we need to have the conversation. Every time we go out and you talk, you have some sort of condescending insult to me, and you don't even think it's condescending. You're just trying to be funny and joking, but I feel hurt. If we don't have a conversation about that, it might go on for years, and I would my self-esteem will get degraded each time I do it, and therefore I'll be less and less likely to even want to have the conversation, and
Right.
eventually I'll just have to leave
Yeah.
in order to
Wow.
end the pain. Right? This is what often happens. So sometimes having the conversation, but at the very least addressing the issue. I don't I don't like it when he or she says these condescending tones. So an action would be just don't go out with them. Don't be in public with them. You know,
Yeah.
I've done this with several friends, and they were, you know, abrasive um, and loud around other people. So I wouldn't hang out with them when they're loud and abrasive. When we're one on one, we were both loud and abrasive, and I would encourage that one on one. But as long as there was other people in the room, I would not pay attention to them. I
Right.
didn't say directly that I won't do that, but I just wouldn't pay attention to them. And eventually they realized that, oh, if there's other people in the room, we're going to be gentle.
Okay. All right.
Right. So, and sometimes you can have a conversation. I'm not saying you shouldn't having a conversation. Often you can. I mean, that's the pinnacle of communication is having words, having a discussion about these things.
Right.
But often we delay acting on our boundaries because we're trying to do it verbally.
Right.
And if the opportunity hasn't come about verbally, you can still make your decision about boundaries, especially these barriers,
Yeah.
and take the actions non-verbally. right? You don't have to have the discussion first. You
Right.
can put a boundary in place without a discussion.
Okay. Wow. So
Okay.
much to dig into here.
Lots going on here. This is why I teach like a 9-week class on the topic, because there's a lot going on here.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you sharing these insights with me. So, for anyone who's listening and wants to learn more about your coaching, about you in general,
Yeah.
where can they go online to find more about you?
I'm currently building a website. I'm hoping to have it published by the time you publish this episode.
Okay.
Unconditional-coach.com.
Okay.
That's my website. Find me on there. You'll find most of my social media links on there. I've got an old podcast, my blog, all that stuff you can access from there. Many things. So find me there. You can also email me, Andy at unconditional-coach.com. That's something else you can do too. So that's where you find me and get a hold of all my stuff.
Awesome. And we'll have links to all that in the show notes at starkreflections.ca. Andy, thanks again for hanging out with me today.
Thank you, Mark. This was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
There's a lot to reflect on in the conversation with Andy, but I think one of the things I want to reflect on isn't necessarily the conversation we had, because I think he leaves us with a lot of things to consider and chew on. And of course, there's going to be a link to the Unconditional Coach website that he mentions. It's how fortuitous some circumstances and situations are. Now, I met Andy at When Words Collide in Calgary. It's an annual conference that takes place in August. Pretty major conference, about 700 or 800 people there, and I've been going for over 10 years. And I guess Andy must have known me through probably originally Joanna Penn's The Creative Pen podcast, because he was a fan of Joe and Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush, and of course they're all friends of mine. And I'm not a brave, extroverted kind of person. I'm mostly introverted. I'm an omnivert, but I'm mostly introverted. But Andy had approached me at When Words Collide. I believe it might have been in the dealer's room. We were walking around, and he just said something that connected with me. Probably it could have been related to, I don't know, where he had heard me speaking or whatever it was. But whatever it was, he put out a bridge. And it was a small bridge, but it was a bridge in which I felt a connection to him. And then we just started to talk. And again, when we met again this previous year, this past year in 2024, August, we reconnected, because I was like, hey, I remember you. And I was about to go to dinner with a few other writer friends, and it was kind of not a business meeting. It was just a casual gathering. And so I asked Andy and I think a couple other people that I've been chatting with, hey, if you don't have dinner plans, why don't you come join us? And I love connecting other people. I love it's something I learned from Rob Sawyer is trying to connect other people. And it's so funny. I was just talking to Katie Cross here at Author Nation, and I'm so excited that I introduced her to Dana Clare at Superstars Writing Seminars this past February, because they've done some really amazing collaborative stuff. And so one of my passions is connecting people, because magic can happen when you connect people and when they create those bridges, mutual bridges of connection. Anyways, so Andy and I reconnected this past year, and then I reached out and I think in person I said, he was telling me about what he does with coaching, and I thought, well, okay, that's fascinating. I would love to talk more with you about this, but I want to talk with you about this in a way I can share with my listeners, because they're really awesome people, and I think they would benefit from it. And so, we did a bit of an email back and forth, and then we actually had just a private conversation first, which I wish I had recorded, because we got into some really interesting things. But then that was sort of a warm up, and then we did the official interview. And then I wasn't sure when I was going to play the interview, because I often have a lot of interviews in the queue, and I'm not sure when they're going to be released. But it was so fitting, I believe, to release this interview at this point in time. And that's very fortuitous. So it reminds me, for you, when you're out and about and when you're connecting with other people, whether it's in the writing community or elsewhere, is to consider those bridges. And then obviously later on in the relationship to consider what those boundaries are. And I like the way Andy, he's a very sensitive person, but he also approaches it with an element of pragmatism and practicality, which is really important. And then he kind of steps back from it and helps us see little things. Like, like talking about something as simple as, well, if I like Mexican food and then you prefer Italian food, and you hate Mexican food and I hate Italian food, or whatever the case may be, well, that's one thing we're not going to do together. Now, I mean, that those are basic things. I think when it comes to other elements of morality and something that's a little bit deeper than, well, I mean, if the reason you don't like Mexican food is is because of racism or something along those lines, that's a little bit different. But I think it helps us see how sometimes relationships can end up becoming toxic or controlling or whatever. But in any case, really valuable conversation, and I'm appreciative that Andy is doing what he can to help people create and maintain those bridges. But that is it for this episode of the podcast. I want to thank you so much for listening. I want to also thank those who support the podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections, who support this podcast in a financial way, as well as those who support the podcast over at buymeacoffee.com/Mark Leslie. Thank you guys so much. Your support means a lot to me, means the world to me. It helps compensate me for the time I put in to the podcast. And I want to thank all listeners for listening to the podcast, because that compensates me in an intrinsic way. And thank you so much for the comments. You can leave comments for the podcast over at starkreflections.com. You can also message me directly. I do appreciate your comments, because it's another reminder that I'm not alone. You're not alone. And, the things that connect with you, the things that resonate with you, love to hear your reflections, and also to be able to, with your permission, of course, share those reflections with the rest of this awesome community. Thank you guys again so much for listening. And until next week, and until next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you, dear listener, great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.